the 1970s, while Land Rover and Jeep were busy making their four-wheel drives bigger, heavier, and more expensive, a handful of manufacturers across 4 continents went the opposite direction. Sweden built a military truck with a luxury car engine. The Soviet Union quietly invented the modern crossover before anyone in the West noticed. And a company that would eventually lose a military contract to the smallest truck on this entire list still built the most overbuilt four-wheel drive of them all. These are 10 mini four-wheel drives from the 1970s that proved small didn't mean weak. Stick around, because the truck that beat a German military contract is coming up, and the reason why might surprise you. Number 10. Jeep CJ5. AMC Era. By the time this CJ5 rolled off the line, it wasn't really a Jeep, in the way most people picture one anymore. AMC had bought the Jeep brand back in 1970, and by 1976 they dropped their own 304 cubic inch V8 straight into the smallest four-wheel drive platform in America. A factory-fresh, torque-heavy V8 stuffed into an 83-inch wheelbase, built for a 4-cylinder era. That's a strange decision on paper. In practice, it worked because AMC never chased horsepower numbers. Emissions regulations gutted the 304 down to around 125 horsepower by the late 70s, a fraction of what the same engine made a decade earlier. Most trucks would call that a downgrade. The CJ5 didn't care, because none of that power was ever the point. The 4-speed manual and low-range transfer case did the actual work, crawling at walking pace over obstacles a modern truck would triple. The horsepower would spin its tires on and stall out trying to muscle through. This is the era where AMC quietly out-engineered its own marketing. The CJ5 Renegade trim, with its wide tires and V8 badge, looked like a muscle car experiment. Underneath, it was still the same stubborn, simple recipe Willys had figured out 3 decades earlier. Solid axles, low gearing, and nothing electronic to fail. The humiliation here isn't about a single moment, it's a pattern. Farmers, oil field crews, and forest services kept buying these well into the 80s, specifically because they didn't need the extra power. Modern trucks were starting to advertise. A stripped-down CJ5 with bald tires would outcrawl a brand new truck twice its price, simply because the geometry and the gearing did what horsepower couldn't. Production continued until 1983, 5 years after Chrysler would eventually take over AMC's Jeep operations entirely. Owners still run these today on the original drivetrain, because there's remarkably little in a CJ5 built to fail. No computer to throw a code, no sensor to corrode, just a frame, 2 solid axles, and a V8 that was never trying to impress anyone. Compare that to what was happening at the rest of AMC during the same years. The company was struggling financially, leaning harder on Jeep sales than almost any other division to stay solvent, which is exactly why the CJ5 kept getting basic, unglamorous updates instead of expensive redesigns. AMC couldn't afford to overthink it, and that constraint accidentally produced one of the most repair-friendly, small 4-wheel drives ever sold in America. Parts interchange across nearly a decade of production, and a barn-stored CJ5 today can usually be brought back to life with tools most owners already have in a home garage. Anyone else run one of these on the original AMC 304? Drop the mileage below. Number 9. Toyota pickup, N30. Toyota didn't even offer 4-wheel drive on this truck for its first year on sale. The 3rd generation Hilux, sold in America simply as the Toyota truck, launched in September 1978 as a 2-wheel drive only workhorse. 4-wheel drive wasn't added until January 1979, almost as an afterthought bolted onto a platform that hadn't been designed around it from day one. That afterthought became one of the most quietly overbuilt drivetrains of the decade. Toyota borrowed the transfer case logic straight from the Land Cruiser. using a gear-driven RF-1A unit instead of the cheaper chain-driven units competitors were using. Buried under the floor was a detail almost nobody outside Toyota's own engineers knew about. The transfer case housing was designed so that a second, even a third transfer case could be bolted in series, stacking low-range ratios on top of low-range ratios. Most owners never touched this. The capability just sat there, unused, in a truck that cost barely more than a family sedan. The era context matters here. This was 1979, deep in the second oil crisis, when American buyers were actively fleeing large trucks for anything smaller and cheaper to run. Toyota's timing looked accidental. It wasn't. The four-cylinder engine sipped fuel next to domestic V8 trucks, while the four-wheel drive system quietly outclassed anything else in its price bracket. The quiet humiliation came a few years later, when a British television crew tried to destroy one of these on camera, driving it down a flight of concrete stairs, submerging it in tidal water for hours, and setting it on fire, expecting it to finally die. It didn't. That stunt became folklore, precisely because nobody was surprised it survived. This body style ran until 1983, when the fourth generation took over. Junkyards and farms worldwide are still full of these, most on their original engine, because Toyota built a truck that was never trying to be impressive. It was just trying to never stop running, and it mostly succeeded. The wider context makes the timing even sharper. American manufacturers were still building full-size trucks around big, thirsty V8s as the decade closed, betting buyers would keep prioritizing power over economy. Toyota bet the opposite way, and the four-wheel drive truck arrived just as gas lines were forming outside filling stations across the country. A compact, fuel-sipping truck that could still climb like a Land Cruiser wasn't a hard sell in 1979. It was close to the only thing that made sense. Did your family have one of these growing up? Tell us what finally killed it, if anything did. Number 8. Honda Acty. Here's the detail most lists get wrong about the Acty. It wasn't born with four-wheel drive at all. Honda launched the Acty as a key truck in July 1977 with a simple rear-wheel drive layout. Four-wheel drive, along with front disc brakes across the range, didn't arrive until 1983, 6 years into production. If a vehicle in this countdown claims four-wheel drive from launch, it's wrong. This one earned it the honest way, mid-generation, once Honda decided the concept deserved more than a token effort. What Honda actually did with that extra effort separates the Acty from nearly every other K truck built. Instead of copying the layout every competitor used, engine mounted under the seats driving the rear wheels, Honda put the engine behind the cab, ahead of the rear axle, in what amounts to a mid-engine work truck. That single decision changed everything about how the vehicle behaves loaded or empty. Weight distribution sits close to even unladen, and shifts further rearward under a full bed, putting more weight directly over the driven wheels exactly when traction matters most. The four-wheel drive system itself was equally understated. Honda's viscous coupling engaged automatically the moment the rear wheels started slipping. No lever, no manual hub lock, just quiet redistribution of power to the front axle. Competing K trucks from Suzuki and Daihatsu still relied on manually engaged part-time systems well into the same decade. The humiliation here is architectural, not dramatic. A three-cylinder, 660 cubic centimeter engine, smaller than most motorcycle engines, in a mid-engine, mechanically automatic four-wheel drive layout that some full-size trucks still don't offer. Farmers in Japan's mountain regions have run these for over 4 decades, specifically because the layout handles loaded, wet, sloped ground, better than anything twice its size. Production spanned an astonishing 44 years, before finally ending, longer than most car nameplates survive in any form, let alone unchanged in concept. What makes the Acty's longevity stand out is how little Honda felt the need to change the fundamentals once they landed on them. Later generations grew more refined. gained air conditioning, disc brakes across the board, but the mid-engine layout and the automatic four-wheel drive engagement stayed essentially untouched for 4 decades. While rival key truck makers experimented with different layouts, trying to chase Honda's traction advantage, Honda simply kept building the same core idea, generation after generation, because nobody ever found a genuine reason to replace it. Farmers in the comments, is the mid-engine layout actually better once you've loaded the bed? Number 7. Daihatsu Taft F20/F50. The name is the joke nobody gets anymore. Taft stood for Tough and Almighty Four-Wheel Touring Vehicle, a name so aggressively confident that Daihatsu's own marketing department must have known how absurd it sounded next to the vehicle's actual size. It debuted in 1974 as the F10, a genuinely tiny 1.0-liter mini four-wheel drive built to compete directly with the early Suzuki Jimny. By 1977, Daihatsu had already outgrown that first attempt. The F20 arrived with a much larger 1.6-liter engine, borrowed directly from Toyota's own 12R unit, nearly doubling displacement in 3 years. Around the same time, the F50 introduced a 2.5-liter diesel option, a genuinely unusual choice for a vehicle this small in the mid-70s, when diesel engines of that size were still mostly reserved for actual trucks and vans. This is where the era context turns interesting. 1977 sat squarely inside a global scramble to build small, fuel-efficient vehicles following the first oil crisis. Most manufacturers responded by making cars lighter and weaker. Daihatsu responded by making a mini four-wheel drive with a diesel option nearly as displacement-dense as some contemporary mid-size trucks, in a body barely over 11 feet long. The quiet humiliation runs deeper than most viewers expect. Toyota liked the platform enough to rebadge it directly as the Toyota Blizzard between 1981 and 1984, selling Daihatsu's own engineering under its own far more prestigious nameplate in Japan and export markets alike. A company that built its own legendary Land Cruiser was, at the same time, quietly selling someone else's mini four-wheel drive with a diesel engine and calling it their own. The Taft name survived until 1984, when the Rugger took over, but the F20 and F50 remained the version enthusiasts point to as the one where Daihatsu actually delivered on that oversized, almost comical name. Giovanni Michelotti, the Italian designer behind vehicles for BMW and Triumph, even produced a luxury-trimmed version of the Taft for European buyers, a detail that seems almost absurd given the vehicle's budget mini four-wheel drive origins. That one-off collaboration later influenced the Bertone Freeclimbers, tying this small, oddly named Japanese off-roader directly into European design history, in a way almost nobody outside dedicated enthusiast circles ever tracks back to its source. The Taft name never actually disappeared either, it just moved. In Indonesia, where the vehicle remained popular, well past its European and Japanese retirement, later Daihatsu Rugger and Rocky models continued carrying the Taft badge locally all the way through 2007, more than 2 decades after the original F20/F50. Number 6. Subaru BRAT. The rear-facing jump seats bolted into the truck bed weren't a design choice, they were a loophole. In 1978, Subaru needed a way around America's 25% chicken tax, the tariff that had applied to imported light trucks since 1964. Subaru's solution was to bolt 2 forward-facing, spring-loaded plastic seats into the bed itself, legally reclassifying the BRAT as a passenger car taxed under 3%, instead of a truck taxed at 25%. Bi-drive, recreational, all-terrain transporter. That's what the acronym stands for, a name built entirely to justify the loophole after the fact. Built on the Subaru Leon platform, it carried genuine four-wheel drive and a dual-range transfer case, engineering that had no business being this thorough on what was, on paper, a tax dodge with a truck bed. The era context is almost too perfect. Late 70s America was drowning in fuel-thirsty domestic trucks just as the second oil crisis hit, and Subaru offered something genuinely different. All-wheel drive, a flat-four engine, sipping fuel efficiently, and a novelty factor nothing else on the market had. Most owners immediately ripped out the bed carpet, since it held water, and rusted the floor pan, and pulled the jump seats entirely to make the bed usable, which only made surviving original examples rarer today. The quiet humiliation is that nobody, including Subaru's own engineers, expected the BRAT to become a genuine cultural artifact. President Reagan owned one for his California ranch. It became a symbol of an entire era of automotive rule-bending, spawning a legacy of chicken tax workarounds that manufacturers still design around decades later, from cargo vans with removable rear seats to modern trucks assembled just across the Mexican border. Sold in North America from 1978 to 1987, and in Europe and Australia until 1994, roughly 100,000 reached American driveways. Most were driven into the ground as actual work trucks. The ones still running are treated as folk heroes of automotive rule-bending, because the BRAT was export only, built in Japan but never sold domestically. Japanese enthusiasts today have to import their own country's vehicle back from Australia or Europe just to own one, since the home market always preferred conventional wagons over an open-bed pickup. A vehicle designed entirely around one country's tax code ended up more available almost everywhere else in the world than in the country that built it. Even the name changed depending on where it landed. Australia sold the same vehicle as the Brumby, the UK as the MV pickup, and other markets use shifter, each a different disguise for the identical loophole underneath. The engine grew too, from the original 1.6-litre E A71 to a 1.8-litre E A81 in 1981, giving later Brats more usable power without changing the tax-dodging jump seats that made the whole vehicle possible in the first place. Be honest, would you actually sit in the rear-facing seats? Number 5. Suzuki LJ80. Suzuki's engineers made one deliberate decision with the LJ80 that changed everything about how the vehicle could be sold worldwide. They gave it Suzuki's first ever four-stroke engine, the F8A, replacing the two-stroke units that had powered every Jimny before it. A 797 cubic centimeter four-cylinder producing 41 horsepower doesn't sound like an engineering milestone. For Suzuki in 1977, it was the difference between a vehicle that could only be sold as a Japanese market K car and one that could finally be exported globally. That single engine swap is the buried fact worth knowing. Everything before the LJ80, the LJ10, LJ20, and LJ50 ran two-stroke engines that couldn't meet emissions and highway speed requirements in Europe, Australia, or North America. The LJ80 could. Suzuki badged it the SJ20 domestically and sold it globally under half a dozen names, and export volume grew larger than every prior Jimny generation combined. The era context lines up directly with the LJ80's success. 1977 through 1981 sat inside the same fuel-conscious window that pushed buyers worldwide toward smaller vehicles, and Suzuki had, almost by accident, built the first Jimny genuinely capable of competing on foreign roads rather than just off them. The quiet humiliation belongs to the vehicles Suzuki was chasing. Land Rover and Jeep had spent decades building bigger, heavier, more expensive four-wheel drives by the late 70s, drifting away from the small, lightweight formula that made their earliest models famous. Suzuki refused to follow. The LJ80 stayed pint-sized, at under 1,700 pounds, while still carrying a genuine ladder frame, leaf springs, and low-range gearing, proving nobody needed to get bigger to stay serious off-road. Production ended in 1981 when the SJ30 generation replaced it, moving to coil springs all around. First-generation Jimnys like the LJ80 are increasingly rare and increasingly collectible today, precisely because they represent the last of Suzuki's original, unapologetically tiny formula. Canada didn't even see the LJ80 until 1979, 2 years after its Japanese debut, making it one of the last major markets to receive Suzuki's small four-wheel drive breakthrough. That lag says something about how cautiously Suzuki expanded internationally, even after solving the two-stroke emissions problem, treating each new export market as its own separate campaign, rather than a simultaneous global rollout, the way manufacturers approach launches today. Worth being precise here, the Sierra badge that's often associated with this vehicle actually belongs to the LJ80's successor, number 4, Volvo C303. Under the hood of a Swedish military truck sits an engine borrowed from a luxury sedan, the Volvo C303's 3.0. Liter B30 inline 6 is the exact same unit that powered the Volvo 164, the company's flagship executive car of the era. Volvo's engineers took a smooth, refined six-cylinder, built for comfortable highway cruising, and dropped it into a boxy, flat-paneled off-road truck built to survive Scandinavian winters and forest terrain. The C303 traces back to a Swedish Army requirement issued in the late 1960s for a replacement to the aging Laplander series. What Volvo delivered in 1974 was built around portal axles front and rear, the same principle Mercedes would later use on the Unimog, raising the differentials above the axle center line for roughly 15 inches of clearance underneath. Combined with locking differentials on both axles, the C303 could cross terrain that would strand a taller, more conventional live-axle truck. The era context matters. This was Cold War-era Sweden, a country that stayed militarily neutral, but invested heavily in domestic self-sufficient defense equipment, rather than relying on imports. The C303 reflects that philosophy directly. Flat steel body panels and flat glass throughout, chosen so replacement parts could be cut and fabricated anywhere in the world using nothing more than basic tools, without needing factory-specific curved components. The quiet humiliation came decades later, far from any battlefield. In 1983, a modified C303 entered the Paris-Dakar Rally and won its class outright, beating purpose-built rally trucks with a drivetrain designed for slow, deliberate forest patrol rather than high-speed desert racing. A vehicle engineered to plod carefully through Swedish mud ended up outlasting machines built specifically to win rallies. 8,718 units were built across the full C3 series before production ended in 1984, roughly three-quarters going to military service, and the rest to civilian buyers, including forestry services and rescue operations that valued the same brutal simplicity the Swedish Army had asked for in the first place. Beyond Sweden's own borders, the C303 found a second life, with the Malaysian Army and Royal Malaysian Police through the 1970s and 80s, alongside civilian users like Telecom Malaysia, proving the same cold-weather engineering built for Scandinavian forests, translated just as effectively to tropical terrain a hemisphere away. Few military vehicles from this era can claim genuine service on both ends of that climate spectrum. Anyone know where a Volvo C303 is still in service today? Number 3. Lada Niva. 2 years before Mercedes-Benz even revealed the original G-Wagon, a Soviet factory had already solved the problem Mercedes was still working on. In April 1977, AvtoVAZ began production of the Niva, the first mass-produced off-roader in the world, built with a unibody structure and independent front suspension on coil springs, rather than the traditional heavy ladder frame and solid axles every rival off-roader used at the time. Development had begun in 1971 under designer Vladimir Soloviev, with the team describing their own target concept as a Renault 5 on a Land Rover chassis. An oddly specific description that turned out to be exactly right. The Niva combined a genuinely compact car-like unibody with a proper 3-differential 4-wheel drive system, center, front, and rear, giving it full-time four-wheel drive with none of the driveline wind-up problems that plagued part-time systems on rough pavement. The era context is where this gets genuinely uncomfortable for Western manufacturers. This was deep Cold War Soviet engineering, built inside a command economy that Western analysts routinely dismissed as incapable of genuine innovation. And yet the Niva quietly previewed the entire architecture of the modern crossover. SUV, unibody construction, independent front suspension, car-like proportions, nearly 2 decades before crossovers became the dominant vehicle format worldwide. It used a conventional ladder frame and solid axles, the exact formula the Niva had already moved past 2 years earlier. Mercedes wouldn't adopt independent front suspension on the G-Class until a full redesign decades later, arriving at a solution the Soviets had already shipped in the 1970s. Exported across Europe from 1978 onward, the Niva captured roughly 40% of Europe's four-wheel drive import market almost immediately, becoming AvtoVAZ's most successful export ever, and the design directly influenced later vehicles, including the Suzuki Vitara. The Niva's toughness wasn't confined to European forest roads either. Soviet Antarctic expeditions used modified Nivas for polar research work, and the vehicle remains in production today in only lightly revised form, making it one of the longest continuously produced off-roaders in the world, trailing only the original Land Rover and Defender lineage, before that nameplate was finally discontinued in 2016. The steering system tells its own quiet story about priorities. Rather than a rack and pinion setup that could fail under sustained off-road abuse, Lada's engineers specified a recirculating ball steering box, a fundamentally simple, repairable mechanism the Niva shares with the Suzuki Vitara. It's widely credited with influencing. Nearly 50 years on, the basic recipe underneath the badge has barely changed. Comment Renault 5 on a Land Rover chassis, if that description just changed how you see this thing. Number 2. Toyota Land Cruiser. FJ40. The Land Cruiser exists because of a captured Jeep. During the Second World War, Japanese forces recovered an abandoned American military four-wheel drive in the Philippines. And after the war, Toyota was tasked with reverse engineering a domestic equivalent using whatever parts were available. That project eventually became the FJ40, the version that would define the Land Cruiser name for the next quarter century. By the 1970s, the FJ40 had matured into something far more capable than its wartime origins suggested. The 1975 model year brought a 4.2-litre, 2F inline-6 producing 135 horsepower, paired with a genuinely low-range 2-speed transfer case that gave the FJ40 crawling ability disproportionate to its modest power figures. Front disc brakes arrived in 1976. By 1979, Toyota even added power steering and air conditioning as options, while quietly revising the gear ratios specifically to make the truck friendlier on American freeways without sacrificing the low-range crawling ratios underneath. The era context explains why this mattered so much globally. Throughout the 1970s, remote mining operations, government agencies, and militaries across Africa, the Middle East, and Australia standardized on the FJ40 specifically, because failure in genuinely remote terrain could be fatal, and nothing else proved as consistently reliable under extended abuse with minimal maintenance infrastructure available. The quiet humiliation belongs to every competitor that tried to out-engineer it with more sophistication. Land Rover's Series 3 offered comparable capability on paper throughout the same decade, but the FJ40's simpler pushrod 6 and separate chassis construction meant a broken FJ40 in the Australian outback or the Sahara could usually be repaired by hand, with basic tools, by someone who wasn't a trained mechanic. Complexity was the enemy, and Toyota refused to add any that wasn't necessary. Production continued in the United States until 1983, and worldwide until 1984, with Brazilian-built Bandeirante versions running even longer, cementing the FJ40 as one of the most enduring, over-engineered simple machines the industry has ever produced. Global production across the full 40 series eventually topped 50,000 units, a modest figure compared to mass-market pickups of the same era, but the FJ40 wasn't built to chase volume. It was built to be the vehicle every mining camp, embassy motor pool, and remote research station in the world could depend on without question, and for the better part of 2 decades. In some regions, there simply wasn't a serious alternative. FJ40 owners, original engine still running, or long since swapped. Number 1. Mercedes-Benz G-Class, W460. Mercedes-Benz built the most overbuilt vehicle on this entire list because of a favor for a foreign monarch, and then lost the contract that inspired it. In 1972, Daimler-Benz agreed to co-develop a serious off-roader with Austria's Steyr-Daimler-Puch, partly at the urging of Iran's Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who held roughly 18% of Daimler-Benz's shares and wanted a rugged vehicle for his own military and hunting use. 7 years of development followed before the W460 finally launched in February 1979. Here's the detail almost nobody mentions. Mercedes hoped to sell the finished vehicle to the West German military. They failed. The Bundeswehr chose the cheaper Volkswagen Iltis instead, the same vehicle sitting at number 9 on this very countdown. Mercedes-Benz built one of the most overbuilt off-roaders in automotive history, and still lost the one contract it was originally designed to win. What they built anyway was a genuinely uncompromising machine. A separate ladder-type frame, portal-style ground clearance, and locking differentials front and rear, assembled almost entirely by hand at the Puch plant in Graz, Austria, a facility Steyr-Daimler-Puch expanded specifically for G-Class production. 5 distinct body variants and 2 wheelbases, launched simultaneously. An enormous range for a brand new nameplate with 0 sales history to justify it. The era context matters here too. 1979 sat at the tail end of a decade where Land Rover had begun softening its lineup toward comfort, and Mercedes deliberately built the opposite, something closer to a Swiss Army knife than a luxury vehicle. The German riot police and Federal Border Guard placed early orders specifically because the G-Wagon refused every shortcut its competitors were starting to take. Assembled in the same Graz facility to this day, the G-Class has outlived its original military ambitions entirely, transforming from a rejected army contractor's product into one of the most recognizable, genuinely overbuilt vehicles ever put into production, now closing in on 5 decades, without a single generational reset to its core architecture. The G-Class did eventually win contracts elsewhere, picking up orders from the Swiss Army not long after the German rejection, along with a long list of government and NGO fleets across Africa and the Middle East that needed exactly the uncompromising simplicity Mercedes had originally built for a monarch's border patrols. It just took losing the contract closest to home first, to the very vehicle sitting 9 places above it on this list, before the rest of the world caught on. The G-Wagon lost to the truck at 9 for a military contract. Wild, right? Let us know which one you'd actually pick. 10 small trucks, 4 decades of proof that displacement and size were never the whole story. If you had to daily drive one of these tomorrow, tell us which one in the comments. And if you want the full breakdown on any single vehicle from this list, let us know and we'll build it out into its own video. Subscribe for more countdowns nobody else is covering, and we'll see you in the next one.